Thanks, everyone. My name is Liz, and I'll be talking about how to measure user satisfaction and intent. So just a little bit about myself. So I currently work at Twitter. And before Twitter, I worked on Google Maps for several years. And before that, I was at Carnegie Mellon studying HCI and CS. Yeah. So a lot of companies these days tend to rely on logs data, partly because it's really easy to describe, and logs data can provide a lot of valuable insights into what your users are doing, what they're clicking on, what flows they're going through, and what they're doing in a particular session. But logs data can't tell you why they're coming to your site or how happy they are using your site. Additionally, logs data can sometimes be misleading. For example, just because someone's spending more time on your site, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're happier than someone who spends less time. For example, if they can't find what they're looking for, they might be on your site twice as long as someone else, and they might be way more unsatisfied. Another example of that is if you think about search. If you're designing something around search, just because someone's conducting more searches doesn't necessarily mean that they're happier. They might not actually be able to find their results, thus they're reformulating their query, and thus an increase in the number of search queries. That being said, I don't want you guys to get the wrong impression. I do think there's lots of value in A/B testing and so forth, but I do want to hit on measuring satisfaction, because that's something that I think a lot of people tend to overlook. So what are the benefits of measuring satisfaction? So the first one is that you can actually use it as a metric that you can track over time. And particularly as a startup, if you're making lots of changes to your sites, you're introducing new features, you're going through major redesigns, you can actually use satisfaction as a metric that you're tracking before and after redesign. And also, as you tend to get more users and as your user base changes or organically grows, you can use satisfaction to see how that's actually trending. And additionally, intent is also important. So if you ask people, why are you coming to my site? As you make changes, you can see, hey, maybe all of a sudden people are using my site differently. Or maybe this new feature that I introduced all of a sudden changes why people are coming to my site. Another great thing about measuring these two things is that you can identify differences across segments. So for example, you can find if there's certain demographics that are way happier than other demographics, and then you can use that to inform your product strategy or your marketing strategy. Also across user types and also across markets. And satisfaction might actually be very different depending on why the person's coming to your site. So someone who's coming to your site to do one thing, that person might be totally happy and they might have a great experience compared to someone who's coming to your site to do something totally different. And lastly, I'll talk about this a little bit toward the end of my talk, but you can actually tie in satisfaction with behavioral logs data. And that's, you can then see like the people who are clicking on this particular thing or using this particular feature, how does that compare to what they're saying about their own happiness? So how do you actually measure satisfaction? So there are many ways to do this. You can go around and actually do a ton of interviews with your users, or try to recruit them and observe them in the lab, and actually ask them, well, you just did these things, how satisfied were you? However, that's pretty costly in terms of just recruiting fees and how much you have to pay them, and also in terms of time. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how you use surveys to actually measure these two things. And these are real examples of surveys. I forget where the one on the left came from, but it was from a hotel I was staying in, and they actually had these surveys sitting on top of all the toilets to ask about your experience with using the perfect flush system, which I thought was really funny. So you can also, surveys can be used offline as well. They don't have to be online. And you can ask about physical experiences. And this is just one from Guild. So the great thing about using surveys are there are lots of free survey platforms out there. It's fast in terms of once you have it deployed, you get a lot of responses, and you can analyze the data fairly quickly. And you get a lot of responses at once. And so for people who work in companies that are very geared toward numbers and are really statistical, this is a great way to do that, to measure these metrics. So how do you actually measure it? So this is the question that I use, and I know a lot of companies use as well. So overall, how satisfied are you in this example with Twitter? And so some things I want to point out are the fully labeled scales and the fact that they're equally spaced and that they're on a 7-point scale. So there are a lot of researchers out there that have done tons of research on various survey questions. If you ever want to attend a survey conference, APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion Research, research, they're all about looking into different survey questions and how do you make sure that the question you're asking is valid and reliable. And so there's actually been decades of research on this one question alone, testing different wordings, different visual formats, horizontal versus vertical, and this in fact is actually proven to be the most reliable and valid. And the reason why the scale points are fully labeled is because you don't want people to interpret numbers in different ways. So the way I interpret it 2 might be very different from how someone else interprets 2. So make sure all your scales are labeled. These particular labels have been tested and are considered to be cognitively equally spaced, which is why I picked them, at least in English. I'm not sure how they translate. Yeah, so this is a question that asks about your overall satisfaction with an experience. But there are also other types of satisfaction questions you could ask. You can ask people to rate their satisfaction with particular features on your site. So this is just an example I made up of Amazon. So you can ask them, how satisfied are you with product recommendations, your Prime account, and so forth. Or you can actually ask them about what I call dimensions. So there are things like speed, or technical reliability, or visual appeal, or ease of use. And the great thing about asking about your overall satisfaction and one of these questions is then you can go back later on and actually correlate them and see if there are particular features or particular dimensions that correlate with satisfaction. And again, notice the fully labeled 7-point scale. So some tips when you ask about satisfaction: don't ask users to compare designs. I think it's okay if you're doing an interview and you're in person with them and you can actually ask follow-ups to really get at why they feel one design might be better than another, and I think that's totally legitimate. But if you're asking someone in a survey, well, do you like this version better or another version, it can be a little bit misleading. So to begin with, if you're asking someone, hey, do you like this improved version better, that is obviously very misleading because you're implying that it's improved. But also, people might think just because something's been redesigned that it's supposed to be better. So even if you're asking the top question, people might feel like they have to say that they like the current one better. Or in other examples, they might be very change averse, and they might say, no, I hate this because I just don't like change. And one of my colleagues at Google does a great talk on change aversion. Another tip about satisfaction is always ask about overall satisfaction up front. Surveys are subject to question order bias. So if you have a survey and you have lots of questions, you always want to start with the broadest questions. You don't want to ask about a lot of features and then all of a sudden prime people into thinking about feature X, feature Y, and what they like or dislike about the site. And at the end you're asking, oh, well, and by the way, how happy are you? Well, you've already primed them with all these other questions. So my recommendation is always to start with overall, how satisfied are you? A lot of companies tend to use what they call a net promoter question. So how likely are you to recommend this product to a friend, family, or colleague? Whichever one you choose, just make sure that it's up front. And make sure all the specific questions come later on. So intent. These are just 2 examples I have up here. So what is your primary motivation for using Twitter? And thinking about your visit today, which of the following best describes why you came here? So a couple of tips here is, the first one is, if this is your first time asking and you actually don't have a good sense of why your users are coming to your site, you might not actually want to start with the survey. You might, as Joe suggested, go out there, meet your customers, talk to them, figure out why they're coming, and then you might want to formulate your question later on. Or if you don't have the time, you could start with an open-ended question. And I know a lot of people don't like that because it is a lot of time to code, but you can start open-ended, ask them, and then once you come up with a list, you can, in future surveys, use a closed-ended list. Another thing is you could think about whether you want to ask them their overall motivation for coming to your product, like in general, or you can focus it on the now and the current moment. So in the top question, what is your primary motivation for using Twitter? People could just answer, well, typically I come to Twitter to do this thing, but today I'm coming to share photos, but normally I don't do that. So there are 2 slightly different questions. So there are many different types of ways to deploy a survey. We have email surveys, in-product pop-ups, which I'm sure lots of you people have seen, and in-product opt-in links. And there are pros and cons to each approach. So I'll talk through some of them. So for email survey, the great thing about email surveys is that you're not actually bothering people in the product, so you're not getting this annoying product, but you are hitting them through email and potentially out of context from when they're actually using a product. So when this person sees this email, they might not actually be using Twitter, and some of the answers and responses that they're giving me might not relate to, they might not be thinking about Twitter at all. But the advantage of using emails are that you can get people, you can get in touch with people who might have stopped using your site. So if you're doing an in-product survey and you want to know why people have stopped using your product, well, chances are they're not going to see that survey, so you might want to actually send them an email. And this is an example of what we call our annual user survey, where we actually benchmark user satisfaction across several markets and across different types of Twitter users. One thing I will note about email surveys are that legally, you should only email people who have opted in to receive research emails. So don't go just emailing a random subset of your user base, because they can actually sue you. So just make sure that your site has some sort of option for that, and talk to your legal counsel. It's quite expensive. I think it's like $12K for each person you email who doesn't actually opt in. So this is another example of an email survey that Grubhub sent me a while ago. And the great thing about this is Grubhub actually does a great job in this email. They tell you how long it's going to take to fill out the survey. So they're like, it's a 3-minute survey. They tell you, hey, we're interested in getting your feedback to help improve this site. So that's also another great incentive. And they make it personal. Like, we look forward to hearing from you. So a question I get asked a lot is, should we offer incentives? So you notice they say get a free gift card. And there's 2 types of incentives, one where you give everyone a small amount, or there's one where it's more of a lottery. So enter to win a chance to win an iPad. And I think a lot of the research, some of the research points to that the lottery doesn't actually improve response rates, and that people, they don't care that they might get a chance to win an iPad. They'd rather get something like a guaranteed tangible incentive. So I recommend offering actual incentives to everyone versus just one big item. In-product opt. So in-product surveys, there's 2 ways to do this. You can have what I call an opt-in link. So this is a screenshot of Twitter ads, or the advertising platforms that SMBs see when they log in. And at the top you say, we'd love to hear from you, take a brief survey. So the great thing about this is that you're asking people to take a survey when they're actually using your product. And so when you ask them, why are you coming here today, they're in the moment, they've got the context. But the downside is they might not notice your opt-in link. And as I previously mentioned, if you're trying to get at people who have gone dormant, they might not see the survey. So pop-ups. We do use them at Twitter occasionally. And I know that pop-ups can be incredibly annoying. But the great thing about pop-ups is that you can actually customize it and have it trigger on a certain action. So for example, if you have a product, say Twitter, and you want to understand why people are reporting users as spam, then you might only want to trigger a survey to those people who click on a certain button, and you can do that with a pop-up. You could potentially do it with the in-product link, but it might not be as noticeable. And the other thing with pop-ups are that you can also do it on exit as well. So the thing with the in-product links are you don't actually know when the person's taking your survey. It could be when they first got to your site before they did anything, in which case they might not be able to tell you what they've done or how satisfied they are with that particular session. And if you did this on exit, you know for a fact that they've actually had the time to use your product. Tracking surveys. So I think, as I previously mentioned, satisfaction and intent are great things to track as ongoing metrics. And I know a lot of people are always asked, well, how do you actually set up a tracking survey? So there are a couple of ways to do this. If you're doing an in-product link, what you can do is actually expose your survey to a small percentage of your users every week or every day. And you can do it by randomly assigning people through cookie IDs. So that's one way I've seen people do it. If your startup doesn't actually have that many people, and you want to make sure you're getting sort of a large amount of responses to track over time, you might not want to have a rolling survey in your product. Instead, you might want to send out a survey once every single quarter or once twice a year. So it really just depends on a couple of different things. How many users do you have? What is your backend framework and so forth. Just make sure you don't oversample your users. So some rule of thumbs that I've heard before, people say don't survey the same people twice a year or more than 4 times a year. So the last thing I want to touch on is combining survey data and other streams of data. So these are just some other types of data that I've identified that you can tie into survey data. So platform data, such as the browser or the OS or the product version. Some survey platforms will actually track browser and OS on their own. So you can cut your survey data by Android or iPhone or web versus mobile, and you can see, hey, are my mobile users happier than my web users? There are also other variables, such as features used, frequency of use, and tenure. And this is another thing you should talk to whoever your lawyer is before you do it. But one thing you could do is actually pipe in variables directly into your survey. So for example, if you knew how frequently someone was signing into your site or when they actually signed up, that could be a variable that you pass into your survey. And you would have to work together with your eng team on doing that. But the great thing about that is then you take your satisfaction, you cut that by these variables, and you can actually start identifying segments of your users that are frustrated or really happy with your site. And that's just some other examples of types of data you can cut by. So if you work on an ads platform, you could cut it by their campaign spend or their publisher tier. And I think that's it.
Hey, thanks. That was super helpful. I have a question about your thoughts on the general kinds of people who take surveys and how that helps you decide like what kinds of things you're trying to track through surveys. Because it seems like, maybe this assumption is wrong, but it seems like the kinds of people who take the time to fill out a survey are a certain kind of user that's fairly engaged already. And so you'd want to limit, like you'd only want to like look for certain kinds of information from those people. Do you have organized thoughts on that?
I
as opposed
do.
To mine?
So this is actually a question that I think it's almost the first question that I always get asked when presenting survey results to my product teams is, well, is the survey data representative? So it's a great question, and basically there's a whole field of research on this called it's basically known as non-response bias. So basically the people who don't take your survey are completely different from the people who take your survey. And there's been lots of researchers who have been studying this. And one thing I will point out that response rates are not actually correlated to non-response bias. So just because you have a 0.02% response rate doesn't actually mean that it's any less representative than someone that has a 95% response rate. But the way you actually check for this is what you can do is you can either ask questions in your survey where you know you have the data in your logs data. So you can ask them like, how frequently do you sign in? Or if you're an advertiser, like what is your publishing tier or how much do you spend? And you see what your survey responses are and you compare it to what you know is factual in your logs. And if there's a difference there, then you reweight your survey data. You reweight the other variables such as satisfaction based on what you know. So what you do is you try to find as many variables as you can to make that comparison. And that's part of the great reason if you can pipe in variables into your survey data, then you can see how different that is, and then you reweight. And in some cases, yes, like totally different. You get your satisfaction score suddenly goes up or down. And in other cases, it doesn't make much of a difference, and you really need to do it on a one-off basis for every single survey you do.
Oh, how about you two?
It's good to see you using a Likert scale, but do you have any non-self-reported data that you correlate with the self-reported data?
That is a great question. I think my philosophy on that is that it's very hard to interpret non-self-reported data in terms of how satisfied a person is. So if you're just looking at my logs data, trying to figure out if I'm satisfied, I mean, that's a very hard thing to do. I mean, you could start asking people in your product how satisfied they are with certain actions, and then you could, if you see that every time someone clicks this, they're really satisfied, then you can start to make that inference. But I still think the best way of actually getting at that is to ask people straight up.
Last question.
You briefly touched on the fact that the qualitative and the quantitative aspect of research. I just want to know, like, throw the chicken egg equation again. What do you do, like quantitative first or qualitative first, and in different situations, like what applies?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think you can start with either. I think you can, for example, you could start with a survey first, and you can ask them like, why are you coming to my site? Like, what are you frustrated with? And then you collect sort of the breadth of data, and then you notice the different things that people are saying, and then you can complement that with in-depth interviews later and really deep dive into each thing. Or you can start with the reverse, where you actually do a bunch of interviews up front, you get a bunch of responses, and then you translate that into a survey that then you're quantifying what you've seen in interviews. So I think you can do it both ways. Yeah, I mean, I think there are pros and cons of each research method. I mean, you can argue that, some companies argue that with A/B testing, that's great for optimization, but then at the same time, it's a bad thing because you could be totally misinterpreting results. And then on the flip side, you have the qualitative interview debate where a lot of people are like, well, that's only X many people, so how do you know? So I think it depends on the research question and what you're trying to solve. But I think I wouldn't say that there's one golden method out there.
Awesome, thank you.